If you can hear me. Awesome.
Hello, Samuel. Good evening.
Good evening, Mario.
Good evening. Glad to have you with us. How are you today?
Good, thank you.
All right. It's a minute before 5 p.m. So let's just give the network members say 3 minutes, 3 minutes grace to join in. Thank you so much, Samuel.
Sure.
Hello, Samuel.
Hey,
Yeah, I think we can commence now. Yeah. So once again, good evening. We have about 8 members currently online. Others will join in as the meeting progresses. So thank you once again for your time, for making out time from your very busy schedule to be with us this evening. And we look forward to having a great time. And I'm very sure that everyone present and everyone who would join they already know what to expect because you're the ones been with us on Slack. I can tell from your session on Slack what today's session is going to be like. So we are very, very, very expectant. Thank you once again. Um, I'm going to allow Samuel to do a brief introduction of himself. I'm not going to do that. Samuel is a senior. Um, how would I put it? He's a boss in the industry. So let me allow him introduce himself and his journey so far relating to market intelligence. Thank you so much, Samuel. Over to you. Thank you.
thank you, Mario. It's nice to be here and my pleasure. Always happy to join these sort of sessions, and I'm particularly excited about this group. What put into it so far. I'm excited about your prospects. So, yeah, just to do a quick background about myself. I've not been in the industry for too long. I'll say my career has probably spanned not more than 10, 12 years. My academic background, I studied accounting and finance in the Caribbean. And that was in the peak of the financial crisis of 07, 08. That was when I really went to college. And I decided at that point that finance would be a good thing to be studying at the time, which was a very good decision that I think I made. But then I moved back to Nigeria, and that was at the point when tech. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Right, good. That was at the point where tech was beginning to start to develop on the continent, and that was at the time around 2011, 2012 when the group of companies called Rocket Internet decided to come and build out e-commerce in Nigeria. So at the time, they were looking to build out a local team. I was serving in Benin back then, Uniben, and they were looking to build out a local team of sort of, just a few sharp people to help build out what is now called Jumia. At the time, it was a very crude operation. I was recruited into the team as some sort of, financial analyst at the time. It was about a team of 20 or so. I won, rinky-dink office in Lekki. But it was a very exciting time to join the industry because, everything was raw. There were no examples for us to replicate, and we really had to build out our knowledge base from the ground up. So I was very fortunate to be part of that team at the time. Not only were we sort of the first local team trying to build out a large-scale e-commerce venture, we were also very heavily supported by the Rocket team out of Germany and France because they had a lot of technical expertise. And what they really taught us then really was the importance of market intelligence and data. It was not like a typical local operation that I would have been used to, where just expect to buy something, put a margin on the price and sell. Every sort of decision that we had to make had to be informed by very deep data and rationale. So, being the financial analyst at the time, I was very well positioned to be the guy doing a lot of mining of that data. So I was having to mine a lot of the transactions data. So my job evolved from being a financial analyst at the time to doing things around pricing. And it was very unusual for there to be a specific pricing role then, because it's normal for you to want to, if you want to buy and sell in Nigeria, you buy at 10 naira, you sell at 20. You just put whatever price makes sense to it and you sell. But these German guys were not thinking the same way. They had to put a sort of a level of intelligence to every pricing decision. So they're looking at things on an aggregate to say, hey, if I buy my phones at 100 naira and I sell them at 80 naira, would that help me sell something else more at 3x the price? So my job was really to make sure that I figured out what the pricing mix for each product would be, to make sure that on the aggregate, we maximize the profit for the company. So at the time, I was really figuring out what categories should be underpriced, what categories should be overpriced, what products should be bundled together, and all of those things. And eventually my role evolved into a more holistic function where it was titled Commercial Planning and Business Intelligence for a part of the business called Purchasing and Production. And what that entailed is that on the production side, it means how do you sell things on the website? How do you present things on the website? So my job was to make sure that, hey, if you land on the homepage, for example, what you are seeing on the left side, is that the most important thing for you to see that will make you buy in that instant? And would that purchase decision that you make be the best for the company in terms of profit? So every single arrangement of a product, every single product bundling, every single brand that you're showing, how big the logo was, how big the size of the image was, those are the things that we called production then, and is also called in some ways merchandising. And on the purchasing side, I was also in charge of sort of figuring out the business intelligence around what things to buy, to stock, and to sell in terms of inventory. So what sort of phones, what sort of groceries, what sort of beauty products, and all of those things. So all of this intelligence that went into the product and the display of the product was what I was focused on at the time. And following that, I moved into VGG sometime around 2013, and it was a very young company then, probably only three or so years into the market. And it was a very different company compared to what you see there today, in the sense that it was much smaller, under 50 people, I believe so at the time. And then, however, the work that was being done at VGG was also very data intensive. The big ventures then were ventures like, AV Tech, for example, that was very focused on the aviation sector and things like that. And a lot of the work that was being done then were very heavily looking at data as well, in terms of, frequency of flights, how the government can extract the most revenue from particular charges here and there. There were a lot of projects around tolling, for example, at the airports, and how, we're looking at how many cars were passing and what should be charged to those cars. So my role then across board was involved in things like investment and commercialization at VGG. And then I moved out of VGG after a very short time, and I received funding from VGG to set up a startup in Nigeria called Sure Gifts. It was the goal of that company is to pretty much pioneer digital shopping vouchers in Nigeria, and we've been doing that since. Ran that with my co-founders for a while, and then went to do some further study at LSE, London School of Economics, where I did a master's degree in social innovation and entrepreneurship, because I was kind of interested in that social aspect of business. And while there, and subsequent to that, I did some work with VGG as well on the greenhouse capital side to help with the investments, and then set up a few other companies like Busher on the side. And I'm also now in the middle of a doctoral degree focused on blockchain economics at IE Business School in Madrid. So that's my general background on the academic and professional side overall. But you will see like there's a theme across board where my experience and my studies have really been focused on a lot of the numbers, a lot of the data, and the value that one can extract across board, both for business and for life in general. And over the past few years, I think I've been more and more interested in economics as a whole. In fact, now I sometimes in my free time lecture economics at some universities here in London, where I currently am. And the reason for that is because, I've found out over the years how important the field is, regardless of who you are, what you're doing, what you studied. Economics as a whole is the one field that affects everyone equally. And you would be lucky if you're in this group and maybe you had studied economics in your undergrad or at some point in life. But as you evolve in your career, you find more and more how deeply integrated the field of economics is to not only your personal life, but your social life, the life of those around you, and everything in general. And that is why, as guys who are interested in pursuing market intelligence and market analysis, you would be nowhere in the pursuit if you do not have a sound understanding of at least the fundamentals of economics. And being able to have economic literacy is what really separates you from the layman when looking at decision making and things in aggregate. So when you look at news flowing out every day, when you look at the actions of the politicians, when you're looking at the actions of businesses and the direction of businesses and the direction of even your lives personally, you realize that a lot of those decisions are just, or a lot of those results that you're experiencing are just a natural consequence of the macroeconomic conditions of the country within which you reside. And generally, economics is distributed into two big buckets. You have the microeconomics, where it's a very interesting field in the sense that it focused on the micro level. So you're looking at yourself as an individual or your household as a unit of the economy. So you're looking at things from the ground up. But on the micro level, that's where businesses and companies where you would work exist. And that's where you think about things like strategy. How do I maximize my own personal output as an individual or as a company vis-a-vis my competitors and things like that? So strategy on an individual capacity or on a corporate level is a microeconomic concept. So when you're doing market intelligence as a strategic input for your company, that is a microeconomic activity. However, all your microeconomic activities, whatever you do, is still subject to the conditions at the macro level. And the macroeconomics are things that affect everyone from the top down as a whole. So you look at concepts, usually three broad concepts of macroeconomics. They are mostly, the GDP, for example, is one big macroeconomic concept that is very important. You have unemployment, which is also a big macroeconomic concept, and then you have inflation. And those three things, no matter how you slice it or whatever you do, they are very important considerations for any sort of market analysis. And the GDP itself, and I don't think this session would go deeply into the intricacies of macroeconomics, because it's very difficult for you to really pick up these things at a technical level in 1 or 2 hours, right? In fact, I'll probably try to end this within 1 hour so that you don't get too much of an overload, and just to give you just a rough idea of what those concepts are, and it would help for you to then go do some sort of further study to dig in deeper into specific concepts. But the GDP in general is as the name implies, is the gross domestic product, and that is a measure of the output within an economy, and that economy being the state where you reside, the local government, or in most measurements, it's at the country level. So GDP is the measure of all that is being produced in the country, and the health of your country, the size of your country, the size of or the wealth of the country, or the national income of that country is measured in terms of the GDP. So when you, as an economic agent, being an individual, when you provide your labor, so you're working for a company, and a company is paying you at the end of the month for that labor, your salary is your contribution to GDP. Your labor is your unit of production. So you've produced your labor to that company, and that company has paid you for it. The sum of all our labor plus the sum of all that the company is producing plus the sum of all the government is producing, all of those new things that are being produced is what is aggregated in the country and termed as GDP. There are two types of GDP measures that you see. You see the nominal GDP and you see the real GDP. But the important one is really the real GDP. The nominal GDP just takes into account inflation. So if, for example, a farmer produces 1 hectare of maize a year, and they try selling the price of maize this year in the same inventory, and next year that price of maize increased by 10%. The nominal GDP of that maize production will increase by 10%, but the real GDP has not increased because only the farmer has not really produced more. The price just increased and the price got inflated. So inflation adds to nominal GDP, but usually economists like to look at the real GDP, which discounts the nominal GDP for inflation. Now, why is this GDP measure so important in terms of your personal sort of lives or social circle, and also for market analysis? Well, it sort of measures the cap or the capacity of the economy within which you operate. So if as a country, let's say you're a little island country that is say a very tiny island, and the GDP of that country is $1 billion, where the value of everything that everyone is producing in that country is $1 billion. And you are a new company that wants to go into business, and you're going into that country and you say you want to set up a new business, and that business is going to be $1 billion company in revenue. You start, any sort of reasonable person or rational person will start to figure out that, hey, if the size of this country as it exists today is $1 billion, where everything everybody's producing is worth $1 billion, can a single entity go into that country and automatically double the economic output of that country? That is a bit of a stretch. It's a bit unlikely. So you start, if you now take that and sort of expand it into a larger market, say Nigeria, where you have, say, $300 to $500 billion production market, it sort of helps you to sort of contextualize the size of the market and how big businesses can get. So when you see a market like the US, where you have 1,000 companies with $100 million revenue, your brain is able to understand that because the market is tens of trillions of dollars in size, in production size, right? So first of all, the GDP helps you to create a cap for what the size of the market is in the first place, before you even start to do any sort of analysis, right? And then the GDP itself doesn't really matter as a measure, as a value. So 200 billion or 500 billion or 1 billion doesn't really matter. What matters to policymakers and to governments that try to come into the market, what matters to them really is the stability of that market and also the growth rate of that GDP. And you can think of the economy itself, as a body or as an engine where, it's like a car that is moving at a particular level. What businesses want, or what the government want, is for the car to keep moving at a decent speed, but not too fast and not too slow. And the reason why, if Nigeria started to move tomorrow at say a 30% annual GDP growth rate, that would be a cause of concern for the government. Likewise, if the economy starts to slow down and move at a -4% or -5% GDP growth rate, that would also be a cause of concern for the government. The government's role really, or any good government's role really, is to ensure that the economy is moving forward and expanding at a measured, sustainable rate, right? So the reason, for example, why economies cannot really grow too fast would be, for example, you can think about the analogy of the car as well. If the car is going too fast, it's starting to overheat. And that is because being literate as economists helps you think about how things are very interrelated. There's your decision to buy a laptop today affects a whole lot of other things that as you approach life, you need to start thinking about how all of these, your actions sort of connect. So let's think about a GDP of a country expanding too fast and too quickly, for example. And what does that mean across board? Well, say suddenly Nigeria starts to grow at 50% growth year over year or every quarter, starts to grow very fast. What that means is that, wow, a lot of things are being produced very quickly. Suddenly you have a lot of companies that are producing a lot of things. You know, VGG is producing too fast, Nestle is producing too quickly, and they're producing because there is demand. You know, you can only produce things if there is demand for that stuff in the market. And once they start producing so quickly, they're producing because there's too much demand. And when there's too much demand for stuff, it causes production to rise. And because companies and resources are scarce in the market, there's scarcity of land, there's scarcity of labor, there's scarcity of capital. The economy these companies cannot produce simply enough. They cannot produce enough to accommodate that demand from a 50% annual growth rate. So what that means is that because they cannot fulfill the supply to that demand, they will increase their prices. That's what happens when there's too much demand for stuff and there's limited supply. When they increase prices, that is essentially inflation, right? The market, the price of things starts to rise in the market. When you have inflation in general and companies are struggling to produce, prices are rising, you as employees in these companies, you as the labor input into the production of those goods and services, the prices are already rising, which means that you cannot, all of a sudden as laborers in that company, you cannot afford goods and services that are being sold by all the companies in the market, right? So as employees of companies, you cannot afford things because inflation is happening outside. You guys start to demand higher salaries. So labor inputs in the production process the value of labor starts to rise. And then all of a sudden, you know, the factors of production start to become more expensive, price of goods become more expensive. Eventually, the companies can start to try to reduce their costs and they start to fire people. And then, you know, all of a sudden you have an unemployment problem because, you know, now companies cannot afford to keep paying you as you are demanding higher and higher wages. So they fire people and people are sitting at home. And now the problem becomes not only can you not afford the stuff, I think about things in the aggregate now, not only can people not afford stuff, people are now sitting at home with no income, unemployed, and then the capacity of people to consume more stuff is being reduced because now more people are sitting at home. Now, because more people are sitting at home, fewer people are buying stuff, right? Which means the company keeps firing more people because now they're not selling as much. And all of these things just sort of become very intertwined and they're affected. And all of a sudden, you know, because you are solving one problem, you are creating another problem and solving this and creating these other problems. So the role of the authorities or the economists or the central bank and the government and the Ministry of Finance and all of these guys is to control the growth of the economy, right? So they're trying to keep the growth rate stable at a sustainable level. They're trying to keep they're also trying to make sure that the economy doesn't slow down at any rate. So that's the GDP measure, and that's why that measure is very important. And then GDP.
Sorry, let me come in shortly, Samuel. So
Sure.
we're going to, that we can also give the guys some opportunity to get clarifications if they need any. So, but we are going to make sure we don't lose track of what you're saying so that we don't.
Sure. So if there's any questions, just stop me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Damilola, you want to ask a question? Let's have a question for the person.
Oh, sorry, no, I mistakenly opened my.
Okay, so Samuel, my question before you proceed, you gave an analogy. So I want to know that hike in price. I was thinking a hike in price is supposed to be a business opportunity. I mean, an opportunity for more businesses to be created. But from your analogy, that is not the case. So my question is there a way a hike in demand, I mean, a hike in demand of a particular product, is there a way it can be converted into a business opportunity? Is there a way to go about it? Or is it just doomed to end up bringing about inflation?
Right, you're right. Typically a hike in demand is supposed to create opportunities for new businesses, because generally, more demand in economics, higher demand, the higher the supply, right? The more the demand, the more the supply should naturally come into the market. The difficulty in supply is that supply doesn't really catch up as quickly as demand, in the sense that, depending on what the product is, the cycle of production could be a while before you can take the product to market. And also, the factors of production is the most important concept there, because while demand might be there for the product, does not mean that the factors of production are available to you, to suppliers. Which factors of production being, capital, which is money to set up that business, which is the labor, that is the talents to do that business, things like land to run the business, and also the skill of the entrepreneur to run business as well. So the factors of production are still very limited, regardless of the level of demand. And on the capital side, for example, the capital side is also, for example, a function of things like interest rates. And that is another macroeconomic concept those are all the things that the government has to sort of manage at the same time. So if there's a lot of demand for, say, because ShopRite is leaving the market, there's a lot of demand for, say, groceries tomorrow. But you as an entrepreneur have to go borrow from the bank at 40% annual interest. You're not going to get into that market just because the cost of capital is too high. So which means, generally supply is a lagging measure of usually the guys that can really take advantage of increased short-term demand are the producers that are already in the market. So that's really what happens, such that if you're a new entrant into the market, unless that demand can be sustained, which is very debatable, you cannot really capture a very short spurt of demand. So that is the problem there. And also another question here says that, doesn't the hike in demand automatically mean that there will be less demand in the future, thereby leading to future deflation? I mean, by the time people can afford it, there will be a reduction in demand, and thus you're right. You're right. So a hike in demand would naturally result over the long term in a hike in supply. So there's a high demand and low supply, right? Which means high prices. The high prices, just like, think about it as Uber, surge pricing, right? Surge pricing in Uber. Increase in demand creates surge pricing for Uber, which increases the supply of drivers on the road, right? And that supply of drivers on the road reduces the price, right? Which means the prices becomes deflated. So if you are an entrepreneur, you have to be able to get into the market quickly enough to capture the prices at the surge level. Otherwise, the market is going to find its equilibrium at a lower level eventually, right? So you're right that a hike in demand should, over the long term, result in reduced prices, not essentially reduced demand. Demand can remain high, just that supply would eventually catch up to it, and the price would come down. So it doesn't result in a reduced demand in the future. It reduced prices in the future. And at what point does causing temporary inflation a good economic policy? Inflation in general is a good economic result, right? Inflation needs to happen in the market. What is not good is for the inflation to be too high for too long, right? So every market needs to have some sort of inflation. That is an important need for the market, because it creates incentives for new businesses to be created and things like that. But there's really, the only incentive for you to create inflation over the short term as a good economic policy is if the prices are getting too depressed. For example, in Greece, when Greece had the big economic crisis and they were having all the prices were being reduced by by like 2% on average. The government had to force inflation by increasing the money supply. So inflation is important because for you on a personal level, you might be happy if the price of things are falling. If you go to the market tomorrow and see that the price of bread has gone down from 100 naira to 80 naira, it's good for you on a personal level today, but it is not good for everybody in the economy because, first of all, you're going to have fewer bakers in the market, less incentives for bakers to do better in terms of their production value. Why would they use better quality flour? Why would they use better quality yeast if the price of bread is going to be falling year on year? People are going to exit the market, supply is going to reduce, and all of those things. So inflation is not really good at a high level, neither is deflation. So you want a really sustainable inflation level, generally around the 4 to 5% range. That's what is generally safe in the market. And what can be done to reduce the inflation in Nigeria? Now that is hard. Once inflation gets to a level where it's high and it's been high at a sustained level for a long time, it is very high. It's very difficult for you to reduce inflation in the market. The government's method of doing that is only one thing, right? The government, they use either monetary policy or fiscal policy to manipulate inflation. And when they try to use monetary policy, they do things like they try to influence the interest rate. So what causes inflation is demand. And demand is caused by consumer spending or government spending. So if you guys are spending too much or the government is spending too much, that will create inflation. Inflation can also be caused by, reduced supply, but let's focus on the demand side of the market for this analogy. So on the demand side of the market, too much consumption, too much money chasing too few goods creates inflation. So what the government tries to do is reduce the money in circulation, and that's how to reduce inflation. So the way to reduce the money in circulation is by making it attractive for you guys to save your money. So what they do is try to increase the interest rate on savings so that you guys are very much incentivized to want to save and not spend. And that will reduce the amount of money that is chasing goods and services and thereby reduce inflation. They can do that. Or they can try to sell treasury bills. So they mop up money from the market by borrowing from you. So they say, hey, government is issuing a treasury bill that is going to be 13% interest rate for the year. If that's good enough for you, you give government your money, and then that reduces the money in circulation. And technically, that should reduce inflation. But the way the market works is that the economy is so robust that all those interventions by governments is typically not good enough to affect inflation now because we are not producing enough, right? So I'll be bold to say that a lot of the inflationary pressures that Nigeria is facing today is because of the supply side of the market rather than on the demand side. It's more on the supply side pressure in the sense that we are not producing enough locally, one, to be able to meet the demand, and two, because we're not able to produce, we are being forced to import. And we are being forced to import goods and services at the same time at the point where we are having exchange rate pressure. So where the value of our currency is being reduced. So because we are having to import stuff and we're having to pay in foreign currency for that import, and our currency is getting weaker relative to the currency we are importing in, the price of our import in local terms is getting higher, which means the price of our goods and services that we are consuming is higher in Naira terms. So a lot of these things connect. So when you're looking at the macroeconomics in an aggregate, you're looking at things like GDP, interest rates, exchange rates, unemployment, inflation, all of these things, and how they affect you as a business, how they affect decisions you make, and how they affect you as individuals as well. So that is just generally on that side. And you see, in just you asking these questions, from talking about GDP alone, we've seen how all of these things sort of connect. We've talked about inflation already, unemployment already, interest, tax, all of the things that macroeconomic concepts that sort of connect, and you cannot really fix one without affecting the other. And when you screw up across board, when you screw up one so badly, it's very hard for you to get in control of another. And I had a question to say earlier today, I was writing an article about the hike in the price of pay TV as a result of COVID. This isn't as a result of inflation, but more as a result of policies put in place by the government. Is there a positive side to these government policies? For example, they banned the exclusive broadcasting of sports by pay TVs in Nigeria. So pay TVs are having to increase their prices for many reasons. So there's no single reason why there's inflation on the pay TV side, if you think about it on a strategic level. For one, the pay TV guys, a big cost of their input is denominated in USD, in foreign currency, or in euro, or in GDP, or in GBP, because they have to pay for a lot of these licensing rights for the things they are showing to Nigerians. They are paying for it in dollars. That is one concern, right? Now, if the Naira was 360 to $1, and they put it in their plans that it was going to be 360 to $1, and they've used that to set their pricing, that's all right. They don't have to increase the price. But now, if previously they needed to sell 360 million Naira to make $1 million, now they need to sell 500 million Naira to make $1 million, which means naturally for them to cover that, they need to increase their price by the devaluation, first of all. The second problem they are facing is that not only is the cost of production, the cost of their licensing and their streaming rights getting more expensive in dollar terms, they cannot even access these dollars, even if they wanted to afford it. They can't access it because there is no forex in the market. There's a high demand for dollar in the market that is not enough for everybody. So not only can they not afford it, they cannot access it. So why is the government then putting into place policies that say, for example, that we've banned exclusive broadcasting in Nigeria? Really, and that sort of surprises me a lot when you look at sort of policies that are being made in Nigeria. Those policies, from the purist economist perspective, they are not very positive, because they assume that doing things that are protectionist like that would trigger or motivate local guys to produce. But we've seen that protectionism doesn't really spur or trigger production. It just creates inflation. It increases it reduces how much is being supplied in the market, and thereby increases the price of things. So personally, I don't see how there will be any positive to creating exclusive broadcasting for pay TVs in Nigeria. I don't see how there's any positive to that. I personally believe in letting the free markets dictate what the reality of things should be. So generally the market would force itself into equilibrium. Equilibrium, for example, if these things cannot be absorbed by the pay TV companies, equilibrium will be when they eventually decide that you have to exit the market, and then we are left with local content priced at local content prices, and that will be what the market equilibrium would be. So at any point in time, the market is always at equilibrium, no matter what it is. So the equilibrium might be unfavorable, but the market is always at equilibrium. And the government cannot really force the market away from equilibrium, because the agents in that market will just exit the market if it doesn't make sense for them anymore. It's another one that says, does devaluation of Naira increase foreign direct investment or foreign portfolio investment? So devaluation of the Naira, does it increase FDI? So it does not. It does not, in the sense that as think about yourself, for example, as an investor that is based in the US, with dollars to invest in Nigeria. So you have $1,000 to invest in Nigeria, and you invest that $1,000 today. You're expecting, say, your expected return from that $1,000 is 10%. You're expecting $110 at the end of 1 year as your own return. That's what you're expecting. So you invest $1,000 and expecting $1,100 at the end of 1 year. And then in 1 year, you invest in Naira assets and, say, you do get your 10% return from the Naira assets, right? So you invest at 360 and your investment grows by 10%. So you have 360 plus 36, which becomes 396. So you have 396 Naira, 396,000 Naira as your return in Naira with 10% return. So you've gotten your returns in Naira. When it's time for you to repatriate your dollars, the dollars is now 475. So rather than getting $110 back, you're getting 396 over 475 back, which is like 80 something percent. You're getting like 860 something dollars back for investing $1,000. So as a foreign investor, investing in a country where their currency is being devalued constantly relative to your own home currency is not a positive thing. So it will definitely reduce FDI. And you're seeing today, for example, where a lot of investors are complaining that they cannot move their money out of the country because of the policies and the devaluation and all of those things. So it doesn't really make sense as a country. And the only point in time where devaluation of your currency is good for you as a country is if you are an export-oriented country. So if you're exporting and your value of the currency is devaluing, it means that your cost of production, so if some guy in the US agrees to pay you $1,000, right, and you devalue, the $1,000 that they're going to pay you tomorrow is going to be worth $450,000 to you today versus $360,000 that it was to you a year ago. So if you're an export-oriented country, devaluation of the currency is a good thing for you. And that's why China, because they're very heavily export-oriented, have been artificially forcing the value of their currency to be devalued for a long time. So how to use the knowledge of economics to do market intelligence? And that's the whole point of this sort of conversation in the first place. Generally, you're trying to look at market intelligence as a company or from an organizational level in terms of strategy, right? So if, for example, you were charged with, looking at, okay, I'm trying to expand into, let's use EduTech, for example, as the EduTech is a company within the VGG group of companies. And EduTech's market focus, for example, is in providing tertiary education to more people in Nigeria, providing better access to university degrees to Nigerians because, leveraging on technology, right? So that's a good business idea. Conceptually, we think, too many Nigerians are trying to go to school and it's important. So as an entrepreneur, you sit at home and think that, okay, any business that can make me get a degree from the comfort of my home more easily is a good business, right? So now EduTech is like, all right, I'm trying to do some market intelligence to even make sure that this business idea makes sense in the first place. What would you as an analyst be looking at over the past month, for example, to see how you can add value to the EduTech business? Well, yesterday, the NBS, Nigerian Bureau of Statistics, released their unemployment report. And it showed that, wow, 27% of Nigerians are unemployed. Another 40 something million or whatever are underemployed. And then not only do we have that sort of situation, 10 million Nigerians have even given up on searching for jobs completely. They've gone back to the village. They say they're not looking for jobs again. They've given up. So they're not unemployed or underemployed or employed. They're just not in the job market at all. And those are adults. And when you look deeper into the data, you see that, wow, for those that are unemployed, if you look at the categories of those who are unemployed, a bulk of the unemployed folks are folks that have bachelor's degrees. So if you look at people who went to university, 40% of people in Nigeria that went to university today are unemployed. And another 30% of them or so are underemployed, in the sense that they're not working up to maybe 20 hours a week. That is a significant piece of macroeconomic data for you as an analyst within the edutech business, because you're then thinking that, okay, great, there is desperation for people to go to school and go to university. Why is that? Well, because there's so much competition in the market in the first place. There are so few people employing, and the reason why so few people are employing is because there are so few companies producing. And the reason for that is another reason. So just very connected. And then as an edutech business, is there really an incentive for you to want to produce more bachelor's degree holders if 4 in 10 of them in the market today are unemployed? Are there things that you can do digging further into that unemployment data point to ensure that your selling point or your value proposition as a business is not to simply produce more bachelor's degree holders, knowing that the outcomes of bachelor's degree holders in aggregate is not positive? How would your own unique proposition be such that, you know, your own graduates are the ones that are getting jobs or that are creating jobs out there? So that sort of data point, for example, on a macro level, feeds market intelligence. And you can look at that sort of, you know, macro level stuff across board. And then you're looking at things like, as a business, consumption and demand for stuff. If you look at, you know, national income, you are seeing that, you know, people are just not earning in the market. Everybody is poor. How does that affect you as a business trying to grow? How much can you really grow? And if you're a foreign business, no matter how much you grow, what does that mean for you in dollar terms, taking into account what the long-term and what the historical policies of the central bank of that country is, and all of these things. So there's no way you can do any sort of market intelligence that does not involve you, first of all, looking at what the macroeconomic factors are for that market and what that means for you as a business. Now, you can be a genius where you navigate, you're able to use some sort of competitive advantage to take advantage of, you know, things that are happening in the market that are bad for everyone and make that good for you. That is interesting and that is good, right? But it is not a sustainable business strategy, because generally long-term sustainable businesses thrive on long-term sustainable economies. So if your business is being fed by exploiting marketing efficiencies and exploiting, you know, unemployment and things like that, in the long run, when the market eventually corrects, you are then going to not have a sustainable business strategy. So that is part of the how market intelligence affects macroeconomics affects market intelligence. That's another question that says, how long does it take for economic policies to start having positive effects on GDP? So depending on what the policy is, it's technically, you know, usually immediately, because a lot of the decisions that companies or individuals make because we cannot really know what the results of these things would be. So a lot of the things that you do as a business are in response to the policies without even the policies taking effect. So, for example, if I expect that an exchange rate policy, I expect that Emefiele in the next 1 week, I expect that he's gonna devalue Naira further. The Naira is gonna go from 475 to 550 in 1 week. As a business, that affects your output immediately, because if, for example, you are a business that relies on importing, right? Because you know that the value of the Naira is going to be worse in 1 week, you are going to try to purchase more dollar today. So what affects prices of things like exchange rates and even goods and services, one of the factors that affect prices is the expectation of what the future price would be. So usually GDP today is in a way affected by expectations of tomorrow. And those expectations are usually shaped by what the policies are today. And that is how, economic policies that are being implemented today, whether or not they're in effect, affects the GDP today. So even if they've not even done the policies, and the market consensus is that this policy is going to take into effect, it's going to affect how people produce, how much they produce, how the price, how the demand, and how this demand and supply interact. It's going to affect all of those things today. So all of these things have positive effects on GDP. And you said, how does per capita income affect GDP and thus market intelligence? Now, per capita income is an average measure of GDP. So there is no per capita. So per capita income does not affect GDP. GDP affects per capita income, right? So per capita income is just calculated by the GDP divided by the number of people who are living in the country. That's the per capita income, right? So per capita income for a country, for Nigeria, for example, is just, if Nigeria's GDP is 500 billion and there are 200 million Nigerians, then the per capita income of Nigeria is 500 billion over 200 million. Per capita income is a nice number, right? But it doesn't really say much about the individual wealth of the people in that country, because, and the reason for that is that per capita income does not take into account income inequality. It's just a simple average, right? So 500 billion over 200 million per capita income. But that doesn't mean that 70 million Nigerians are not earning under $1 a day, because it may be 500 billion, but that 500 billion might be concentrated in the hands of just 10,000 people, while everybody else is poor. So in terms of market intelligence, right, per capita income of a country is good. For example, you go to Qatar, and you see that per capita income of Qatar is very high because they're a big oil-producing country. Oil has a lot of value, which means they have a lot of billions or hundreds of billions of dollars in GDP. Their population is very low, so lots of a high GDP, low population, divide that, create a high per capita number. That does not mean that everybody in Qatar is rich, and that does not mean that you, as a potential business entrant into Qatar, should look at per capita income as a measure of wealth. So it's not a bad, it's actually quite a good question, because a lot of people look at per capita income of a country and say because of that they are wealthy. But as a business, you need to take into account who your target market is, and if that per capita income is truly reflective of the personal or household income in that country. And that's a good question. So how do you calculate the purchasing power of a country, or rather individuals in the country? So the purchasing power of a country, as measured by sort of the PP or PPP, is a purchasing power is a relative measure, in the sense that the purchasing power in a country is only measured relative to the purchasing power in another country. So if, say, you have a comparable product in Nigeria. So you have this hand sanitizer in Nigeria, you have a hand sanitizer in the US. If 100 naira can buy this hand sanitizer and $1 can buy this hand sanitizer in the US, that is pretty much the purchasing power of $1, right? I think there's a school of thought in economics that, across the world, there's purchasing power parity and all that stuff, but it's not real in the sense that, purchasing power is important, and it also helps you to measure individual wealth. So I might be earning 1 million naira in Nigeria. Because of the purchasing power of 1 million naira in Nigeria, the things I can buy with 1 million naira in Nigeria, right? That would make me poor in the UK, because 1 million naira in the UK right now is, 1,700 or so pounds a month, and that cannot really sustain anyone that's living in London unless maybe you're a student and you're in a shared accommodation and things like that. So, in terms of marketing intelligence, how does purchasing power sort of affect your business? Well, if you're thinking of yourself, if you're looking at yourself as like a global business, where you, for example, you're a guy like Netflix, or you're a guy like Uber or Google, you're a global business, you're trying to run a business globally. The purchasing power in each country influences how you price your products in that market. So, because you, as Netflix, for example, your Netflix in the UK is I think £10 for 1 month for the basic suite. A direct conversion into naira will make that 4,500, 6,000 naira today. Because you're a global business, you cannot, and you have a global customer base, you cannot price everyone at a standard level. You have to take into account the purchasing power in each individual country to do your pricing. And if the purchasing power in a particular country is very high relative to their own local currency, as a global business, there's really no incentive for me to go into that country, because, if Nigerians are expecting me to sell Netflix at the equivalent in naira of £1, then Nigeria is not really an exciting market for me as a company, being a global company, right? So that is where sort of purchasing power, that's where it affects a company's strategic decision making. Is in things like pricing, is in things like how much you should even produce. So a company, for example, trying to make a decision about how much to produce. So if you want to start a business in Nigeria today, and you look at Nigeria and like, oh man, I want to start producing luxury leather bags in Nigeria, right? Nigeria has 200 million people. I want to start producing luxury leather bags to 200 million people. If I just capture 0.5% of that market, that's 1 million people buying my luxury leather bags, and I sell each bag at equivalent of $100 a bag, so I make $100 million in revenue and all of that stuff. So that's nice and fancy, right? But when you drill down into the details of that macroeconomic data, you will find very quickly that you producing a luxury leather line in Nigeria, you have to be very careful with how you assess the market, because is there a market for luxury leather items in Nigeria that is big enough, right? And you start looking at things like, okay, if 70-something% of the population are either unemployed or underemployed, that first of all wipes out 3/4 of your potential market. Then you're like, oh, the rest of them are at least employed. Thank God, they're employed. But this employed demography still includes those ones who low level employment. It includes, security men, it includes drivers. They are employed, they're fully employed, right? Right. So those low-level employment and low-level jobs wipes out another 20% from your 75%. So all of a sudden you have 95% of your market, first of all, just not qualified for your leather, luxury leather bag. And then you're like, okay, looking at things, okay, good. I have 5% of the market still in decent employment. What does decent employment mean in Nigeria terms? You start looking at purchasing power, parity, and other things you've said. In Nigeria, you have a decent employment if, say, you have 150,000 naira a month in salary. That is considered decent in Nigeria. Now, if another half of what's left in the market are earning around 150K because they are well paid, that means that there is no discretionary income to be able to afford luxury, such as leather bags. So all of a sudden, you are starting to break down the market into more important companies and product-specific market intelligence that shows you exactly what you should be producing, who you should be producing for, what basket of goods you are competing against, among other things. Now, in Nigeria, you find that all of the businesses that thrive, right, tend not to be businesses that help, that, not to be businesses that take more from your share of income, because today, most Nigerians are already fully extended on their income. The rent, the food, the clothing and shelter, and some liabilities already take out the 100% of their income. Their disposable income is already fully disposable. There's no extra discretionary income that allows for things like luxury purchases, extra savings, and things like that. So that's why a lot of the businesses that tend to scale in Nigeria today are these businesses that allow people to be able to move the money around, not exactly create new money. So things like loans. I'm trying to get more money to move around, or OPay. All these payment networks. I'm withdrawing, I'm depositing, I'm withdrawing, so a lot of businesses that thrive in the market today are businesses that are taking advantage of the velocity of capital movements rather than the size of capital in the first place, because that's small in general, right? So if you are in the market as a business counting on taking a share of consumer wealth, taking a share of production, taking a share of personal income, you have to be really careful what you're competing with by taking into account macroeconomic measures, which are GDP of the market in aggregate, GDP of your own target market, unemployment across board, because unemployment affects production, it affects prices and things like that, and also inflation in general. I say, if I'm getting you right, it means that for a new company to enter the market in another country, they must have put into consideration not just the purchasing power, but also the percent of the population that can actually afford it, or to determine exactly. So this is exactly the point, in the sense that market entry of a business is not only about micro level competitive advantage between two companies. It's not a pay stack versus flutter wave type consideration every time. Those are really macro level, company level, strategic decisions to be made. But all of these decisions have to be made within the context of the macroeconomics. So what is the market like in the first place? What is the market like today? What is the market looking like it's going to be like in the medium term and the long term? How well can I access my factors of production? What are the potential barriers to entry that the market itself is going to impose, or my barriers to exit? If I put my factors of production to work, say I put my capital to work in this country, what is the direction of the exchange rate policies that is going to affect my ability to repatriate that capital profitably in the long run, in the medium term, or in the short run? If I'm going to a new market, what are the labor conditions in that market, right? people are unemployed in the market. Okay, why are they unemployed in that market? Do they have enough skills to be able to produce what I'm trying to produce? Or are they unemployed simply because there's not enough consumption in that market for there to be enough production in the market, for there to be enough work for people in the first place? Because unemployment can be a consequence of many things. Unemployment can be a consequence of the fact that there's just too little demand for goods and services in the country. And because there's so little demand, there's so little supply. And because there's so little supply, suppliers are the producers and they're the hirers of labor. So because there's so little supply, these suppliers demand only so few the number of, so little number of laborers. And because of that, you have a lot of guys who are jobless because the demand is so low. And it's just a vicious cycle because lower demand, lower supply, creates even lower demand, creates even lower supply. So institutions like governments try to step in to try to boost supply, boost demand, and boost supply. But when things have gone into so much of a depth of failure, it's very hard for an institution like government to do interventions, for example, on the fiscal level, like government spending or taxation, that will really spur this growth at a very noticeable level. And these things have to be done over a long time. Monetary policy, for example, as I mentioned earlier, helps to control inflation and things like that, and demand. Likewise, fiscal policy, the FISCAL policy, just takes into account how the government tries to spur demand and supply in the market as well. And they do this with things like how much government spends themselves and how much government tries to stimulate money supply. So example of how government stimulate money supply is with taxation, right? Governments technically, and that's why it's so weird, the way a lot of policies have been implemented in Nigeria, because all these things are here and there. Government increases taxes as a method of reducing money supply in the market, because there's too much production and too much demand. Government uses tax increases to reduce money supply. So the higher the tax that you have to pay as an individual, the lower the amount of money that you have to spend. The lower the amount of money that you have to spend means that that should reduce inflation, which is good in a way, but it also reduces production. And when you reduce production, companies have to fire people, and that increases unemployment. So one has to wonder, right, that what is the most, and that's why it's very difficult for governments to solve the problems in Nigeria, because it's very difficult for them to do one thing without affecting another thing in the first place. So right now, by Lagos State government increasing all of these taxes, it might help inflation, right? But it's going to trigger unemployment, which is going to further trigger lower demand, and you keep reducing inflation. But now, what is the better problem to have? Low inflation or high unemployment, right? It's just a very difficult problem to solve, right? Well, I would imagine that what Nigeria needs more right now is to worry less about inflation, and worry more about ensuring that there's demand and there's production, and inflation can be solved downstream. So things like that, right? So generally, I think I'm already running over the time that I thought I was going to spend. All these in general just show how, as you approach life, as you approach business, as you approach any sort of analysis, do not do any of these things without having the market context, right? Because that all of that sort of determines whether or not you should even do any sort of analysis in the first place, right? And macroeconomics is stuff that you shouldn't even take lightly at all. And you should also be able to think about life in the sense of how demand and supply always interact in any manner. So all of this, the exchange rate, for example, is just a function of demand and supply, because the higher demand for dollars, the higher the value of dollars relative to naira. That's all. That's all that is causing the devaluation of the naira. It's not anything about the central bank is doing. It's not anything that the market is doing. It's just because the market demands more dollars relative to naira. That's why naira is devaluing relative to it. That's all it is. When you look at your interest rates on T-bills and why they're falling, it's all demand and supply. There's so much demand for government treasuries in terms of how people are trying to preserve their capital, that the government is making it less attractive by reducing the interest rates. That's just how it is. So all of these things, you have to start thinking as economists in general, and the way we do that is just to sort of investigate everything from an economist perspective. So look carefully at news. When you see news about GDP, when you see news about unemployment, inflation, interest rates, exchange rates, and other macro level considerations like population rates, birth and death rates, all of these things, taxation rates, and what could be going on in the minds of these policy makers as they come up with these policies. So when you think about things like that, that would ensure that your market analysis is very robust. And that's why when you see all of these reports that you analyze, when you see all of these reports, you see that they always start with the market. Nigeria has this GDP, this is the market size. You always have to start your analysis with analysis of what the macro level environment is. Otherwise, everything you say is just pretty much fallacy. And that is why macroeconomics is essentially very important in any sort of strategic decisions you make. And you see, for example, how a lot of the companies right now, because of macroeconomic conditions, are trying to diversify their income streams and their currencies. They're trying to target, the poor because that's where the market is. They're trying to go to other markets. They're trying to move away from the naira. So all of these things are decisions that you need to be able to make. And if you're in the market intelligence group, maybe on WhatsApp or elsewhere, a lot of the news that you see people dropping in those channels would be news around interest rates has risen, short prices leaving the market. Why are they doing that? Well, if you read their annual reports, you will see all the macroeconomic factors that they considered before making a decision to leave Nigeria. Nobody wants to leave, but macroeconomics is exactly what is forcing that company to exit the market. And for a new company to come and take their place, those guys also need to take into account macroeconomic conditions. And that's why, you guys need to be very, very attentive to all of these things on the macro level before you start even thinking about things on the micro level, on the economic side, like household income, personal income. Those are microeconomic terms. And then looking at both together, you can start thinking about things on the organizational level. And then that is strategy, competitive advantage, and all of these things. So that is without sort of, overwhelming you with too much economics jargon. You get the idea of why these things are important and why you should take this seriously. And it would be useful if I think I'm not very active on Slack, but I think you have a WhatsApp group. Just drop questions there anytime you come into some sort of economic policy direction that you find a bit confusing. And I'll try to explain what would be the rationale for doing that by the policymaker and what the potential impact that would have on the market in terms of on the companies and the market, on the individuals in the short term and in the long term. So yeah, so all of you eventually have to be economics, whether you like it or not. And hopefully you start to really enjoy it and see how it's very important to everything. Open to more questions. Otherwise, I think
so much. Learned quite a lot about macroeconomics. Thank you so much. So before you go quickly, I'd like you to, because we have like our topics. The topic was divided into two: macroeconomics, and the other was based on market analysis. So I'd like you to share some best approaches to carrying out market analysis, both for industry-specific market analysis, generic market analysis. Thank you.
Right. So, yeah. So the market analysis usually take a few. There are usually a lot of existing frameworks that people tend to follow when doing market analysis. There are some very popular ones, all these general, SWOT type things, PESTLE, all these things. These are, things that are the baseline everyone should be able to think through. So in the analysis of market analysis, what we're essentially looking at is you're looking for what the strength of the market is, what the weaknesses are. So pretty much any market analysis is in essence a SWOT analysis. That's what usually it is. Most people don't like it using SWOT anymore in the format of SWOT, but whatever you're doing would eventually be a SWOT at the end of the day, right? So in looking at what the strength of the market is, right, you're looking at the robustness of an economy at the macro level, right? You're looking at the strength of the GDP, the growth rate of that GDP, and how sustainable it's been, and how sustained it's been over a good period, how likely it will be to be sustained. Looking at the size of the labor population, size of the labor market. You're looking at so all of those things would be things that you'd measure as part of your market analysis at a company level. And that's also down to the industry level. You look at the same things. What is the size of that particular market, and that would be pretty much what is the GDP of that particular industry. Is it big enough for you to want to go play in? Is it small enough? Is it attractive enough? Is there room for growth in the sense that if the value or the income of the population is this size, and this particular industry grows by this percentage, are you saying that the income is growing to accommodate that growth, or you are taking a share of another industry into that industry? So things like that has to be considered when doing an industry level market analysis. Also, you're looking at things like, what is the taxation like in that particular industry? What is the labor conditions like? And then are there people to hire? Do you have to train? What is the cost of labor? Looking at what the capital is like in that industry. What is the cost of capital? And generally, why are people not playing there today? And what are the threats? So why are people not playing there today will be the T in the sport. So what are the threats of that particular industry? Is it because there are just too many barriers to entry, which would, for example, be regulatory costs in terms of licensing regime is too high? Are the risks too high in terms of if you get too big, you might get shut down or nationalized? Those are political risks that you're looking at. You're looking at things like the ease of entry for new competitors. You're looking at, okay, if I grow this market and it becomes big and attractive, how easy is it for new people to come in and compete with me, thereby depressing my prices up to the point where I have pretty much zero profits, right? Because the more competitors, lower the profits for everybody, right? So how can I create enough barriers to entry such that the goal of every business is to become a monopoly, right? So what are the things that I can do to create monopolistic profits for myself as a business? So those are the things that you need to look at for market intelligence, right? And if, for example, there are regulations that prevent you from being a monopoly, which usually there are, things like antitrust laws and all of those things, how can I be competitive against my competitor in this market? And then you're looking at things on the more, if market is big enough for more than one player, that's a good consideration. Otherwise, you look at the market and say that, hey, this market is only big enough for one player. If that player is me, that is good. But if that player is me and I cannot protect my position in the market by creating barriers to entry, it's so easy for a new entrant to come and compete with me, then is it worth it in the first place for me to invest long-term capital in that market? That's a question for a market intelligence analyst to answer. So things like that. So generally, in terms of how to structure analysis, you're looking at things on the market level, looking at things on the industry level. But in general, what you're doing is pretty much a SWOT analysis, looking at the political environment, the weaknesses of the environment itself, the threats that it poses, and all the strengths that are inherent in it as well. So that would be what I'll say is the approach. There's no one size fit all, but I think just approaching the market, you depending on what you're trying to analyze. But by the time you look at the market as a whole and drill that into the industry, the template pretty much just spills out itself. There's no one way to do any sort of analysis at the macro level. It's just all the macro level reports technically just look the same.
Okay, thank you so much. So the final question, we just have to think. Okay, I think someone wants to ask a question, but I have a final question before I'd ask you to recommend a book. So what are some of the ways to prevent or to create that barrier to entry you spoke about? Do we do what Facebook's been doing, buying up, new startup, or what do you say about that?
That is what a lot of companies try to do, right? And that is really the core of strategy, creating barriers to entry for things. So there are many ways, right? The most popular, I think, over the past decade, particularly in the technology space, is via network effects. And I just wrote a paper about that as well, but for the blockchain space. Network effects tend to be the most formidable way to create barriers to entry that is independent of external factors. So you don't need the government to do that for you. You don't need the market to do that. So what it means is pretty much, it means, if you can create a product where the more people use that product, the more valuable it is to everyone in the product. So an example of a product that has very strong network effects would be, say, a Facebook. So Facebook has good network effects that makes it difficult for you to switch from there, because initially when Facebook launched, when Facebook had 10 people, it was nice. When they had 100 people, it was good, right? But the more people joined Facebook, the more valuable the network became, and the harder the harder it is for you as a Facebook user to switch from Facebook, because all your friends are already there. If you switch from Facebook to a new social network today, you're gonna have to start building out that network from scratch. So as a business, right, what you want to do to protect your market share is to increase your switching costs. So make it difficult or expensive for people to switch from your product to another. And Apple has done that very successfully, where they make it very difficult for you to switch from an iPhone to an Android, because if you have an iPhone and you have a MacBook, you have an Apple Watch, all of those things are very much integrated in a way that, it's going to be so painful for you or for your productivity to move away from your iPhone into an Android phone while still having an Apple Watch, because it makes your Apple Watch almost useless, right? So they tie a lot of all your high value items together so that you cannot move away from the ecosystem. So creating such network effects where it's so they make the product so much intertwined into your life, makes it difficult. So creating high switching costs, via network effects is a good way. Switching costs can also be done, for example, for consumer products like, where, you buy a product, say a printer, and then because you buy the printer very cheaply, you have to buy an expensive ink. So there's many product strategies that one can do to create company level barriers to entry and also high switching costs. But I think generally a way to really protect your market is if you can find a market that has high network effects in the first place, and these network effects can create very high switching costs for your customers. And that will pretty much be all you can do until the government says they are too big to fail on all of that. Now what is the future of blockchain technology? Oh, that is a big question that, it's going to take a while to figure out. I'm still doing a whole doctoral program on that question. But the future of blockchain is pretty, it's pretty well defined in the sense that, we know there's a future there, in the sense that, the present is already significant. Blockchain is already being implemented in many industries. I use blockchain is very, for example, well integrated into my own personal life, for example, on the currency side and all of those things. But the future is big in the sense that there is a potential for a lot of the value or assets that are created today to be represented on the blockchain. And that's where I think the biggest part of its future is, in the sense that, a lot of things where, for example, you have land today, and land as an asset today can only be ascribed value because you own the paper title documents. Blockchain has a future where it allows 1,000 people to own a piece of land that is as small as this, because the blockchain technology allows assets that are hard to be fractionalized in very tiny pieces in a digital form. And that is potentially a very big future for what it means in terms of how people can begin to own things, how people can begin to create wealth for themselves, how capital begins to flow across borders and all of these things. So it's a big industry, a very technical one that requires a lot of experts from very different fields. So we have a lot of experts now on the engineering side that have figured out to a very significant level the blockchain technology itself and the security and the engineering part of it. What we don't have a lot of right now, and where I'm trying to specialize as a doctoral student now, is on the economic side of things. So you have the tech now. What does that mean in terms of capital flows, incentive systems? How do you design what's the mechanism designs for people who are trying to make money from mining? How do you determine what the optimal transaction fees are like for each particular blockchain? So all those economics part of things, you need people in that space as well. So it's a big, broad industry. If you want to specialize in blockchain economics, it's a huge emerging field that you would find quite technical, but also very interesting. I welcome a lot of people into that field as well. But the field is still it's a very futuristic field, but it's big.
Thank you so much, Samuel. I think Chinyere has a question, and that will be the final question for today. Cool. Chinyere, you can ask your question. Hello, Chinyere, are you there?
Sorry.
Bad network, most likely. Yeah, I can hear. We could hear you for a second, but I think you're back off now. You can type it if it's the network is too bad.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, sorry, I didn't want to put in because of distractions and all of that. But I just wanted to hear from your viewpoint. You were talking about economies, like the economy affecting people and them getting unemployed and everything. So I was just, since you're dealing with social economics, that's like kind of your thing. So I wanted to ask, people's salaries like it makes a huge impact on their profits and all of that. When it comes to big corporations, like I don't understand, why do they always have to lay off people? Why do they always have to fire people? Like why do they have to sack them? Like, is it that the big numbers we are seeing, that this is their profits? Is it that all of that is just I don't know, but I think you get what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. This is good, right? Because you're starting to ask very economics focused questions, and these are usually questions that you guys should be able to answer very quickly, right? So you have to understand what the role and what the original mission of these companies are in the first place, right? And if you go to the School of Finance or the School of Economics, and from the very beginning, what they drum into your psyche is that the role and the ultimate 100% role of business, the reason why businesses exist, is to maximize value for the shareholder, right? There's a popular Adam Smith quote that says, it's not because of the benevolence of the baker or the butcher that we have our bread and meat, right? It's because of the free hands of the market. It's not because people are nice and good, right? So ultimately, for every business, right, all they should be thinking about 100% of the time is their bottom line, right? Even when they're doing all this CSR and social campaign, Black Lives Matter and all of these things, they are doing all of those things simply because it affects their bottom line. Otherwise, they shouldn't do it, and that would be irresponsible of them to do it, right? Now, you have giant corporations that have, maybe they're public companies. They have 5,000 employees, right? They're making $1 billion in profits every year. Now the economy is seeing a slight depression, and their profits for that reason is going to fall from $1 billion to only $300 million in profit. That's a lot of profit, right? That's a lot of profit still. $300 million is still a lot of profit, right? But you don't wonder that why do they have to fire innocent 500 people when they can still keep them and make $300 million in profit? Well, the answer to that question really is that nobody's going to give anybody any free lunch, right? And one has to really be able to separate the economic incentives and decisions that companies make from social expectations, right? One should be able to forgive. And I studied social innovation, social entrepreneurship in my master's, right? So the school of thought in that side is that businesses have a responsibility to the community and all the social things, right? Because I also have an economics perspective, I understand why it is impossible for a business to maximize the value of their shareholders at the same time maximizing the value of all the other stakeholders, right? So if, as a shareholder, you decide not to fire people and just pay out free salaries when you can afford to use less employees, right? It is not the companies that is being punished. It is me, your shareholder, that are taking dividends out of, that are taking money out of my pockets, right? Now, who are these shareholders? These shareholders are not just although they are overwhelmingly the rich boys in Silicon Valley, right? But for public companies, these shareholders are also people like pension funds, people who have already taken investments from everybody else in the market, right? So if you think about it as, public companies not firing people is them not protecting the interests of their owners or maximizing the wealth of their owners. And think about the fact that their owners could be the entire market because everything is so connected, right? If Apple does not maximize profits tomorrow, and Apple is a public company, and the shares of Apple crash, it means the value of pension funds that are invested in Apple has crashed. It means my personal wealth that I invested in Apple has crashed because the value of Apple crashed, right? It means because my personal wealth has crashed, I'll have to sell my Apple shares at a lower value, and then I cannot consume and purchase goods and services at a good price anymore, which means that will create more layoffs and all of that down the line. So the economy is so well connected that everybody needs to do their job and do their job exclusively, right? If the businesses start doing the job of governments or charities, it would affect their bottom line. The bottom line will affect their value. The value will affect personal wealth of people across the market, and that personal wealth would affect demand in the market, and that demand would affect production, which will create even more layoffs systemically, right? So let everybody do their piece, but the piece of business is to maximize value, because if they don't fire now, and everybody sees that the value of MTN has gone down because their profits went down by 50%, nobody will who say that because they didn't hire you, so they have to do what's best for their shareholders, and that is it. I think about it that way.
Awesome. A comment in the chat box said, "Wow, I never saw from this perspective." Really, you did a good
It's all
job.
connected. Yeah, it's all connected.
Yeah, explaining that. Thank you so much, Samuel. We really do appreciate your time.
No worries, my pleasure.
It's been a very fruitful session. And if you don't mind, you could spare just 5 minutes. Let's get to hear from the members. Let them share their feedback, what they think of the session. Good. So guys, you can unmute. Let's take one after the other. You can unmute and share your takeaway from this particular session. Thank you.
Hello, Samuel.
Hi.
Yeah, I really want to thank you for this section. It was actually an eye opener. Now, I really didn't have economics background, but hearing all this now has even made me motivated to know more.
Definitely.
And to see that it's actually much broader than we actually thought. Like everything just seems so connected. So you doing something here definitely affects it. So you have to take cognizance of the whole factor in a broad perspective. Thank you so much for the time. It was good value.
My pleasure.
The person will call it a day.
Yep.
Hello. Okay, so for me, I almost didn't want to join because I was like, I have some knowledge of economics and all that, but the way Samuel shows the interrelationship between so many factors was just so eye-opening for me. The unemployment, the profitability of companies, how it affects pension companies. I work in the financial services industry, so it just broadens my knowledge of so many things, and it makes me honest. It makes me, look at even our government as a bit helpless because saying that they can't just reduce inflation rate as it might affect some other things like unemployment, just broadens my mind on so many things. So thank you, Samuel, very, very much.
Cheers. Awesome. Thanks, guys. Really enjoyed
it. Samuel, on the final note, would you please recommend a book on macroeconomics, a book that does justice to the subject?
Oh, yeah. So to really get deep into sort of, the fundamental classical economics, the best book that, the first book they ask you to read instead of undergrad is more like, there's Wealth of Nations, an old book by Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. So that really explains that if you can get there from the beginning to the end of that book, you are a classical economist, and then you can now start breaking things down. It's a bit technical, but it's very fundamental to the economics mindset. So if you can get that book, and I'm sure there are plenty e-copies around the world right now that you can find, that you can download. But if you can understand that book and read it and really be able to sort of at least pick one or two things from there, you will get into the minds of the most important economists in the world, in history, the father of economics in general, and you start to see things a bit differently. Ray Dalio, How Economics Machines Work. I think I've heard about this, and I think it will also be a good book as well. I think it's a bit more simplified, but if you do read that as well, that will be sufficient too. There are many other very interesting books, I recommend here and there, but Wealth of Nations is just the father of all books. But yeah.
Okay. Once again, thank you so much, Samuel. It's been a very fruitful session. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. We look forward to having you some other time, right?
Anytime. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
If he wants to say something.
No, I'm good. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.